everyone, my name is Maxine Ziegler, and today I will be presenting about the Menomonee River. I chose the Menomonee because of its proximity to campus, and I thought it would be interesting to learn about how the geography of the river valley has shaped my immediate surroundings. I did my observation about this section of the river parallel to valley fields along the Hank Aaron State Trail. Moving on to a little bit of history, the Menomonee River Valley was formed by melting glaciers over 10,000 years ago and was home to many Native American tribes before the arrival of Europeans and the subsequent industrialization of this area. The word Menomonee is derived from the Algonquin word for wild rice, Menomin, which flourished in the wetlands of the valley and sustained the Native American population that resided in the region. The Potawatomi were the primary residents in the 1700s, but other tribes like the Ojibwa, Fox, Menominee, Winnebago, among others, lived here at various times. In 1795, Jacques Vieux, a French-Canadian fur trader, established the first permanent trading post in Wisconsin along the bluffs of the valley and ultimately sparked the industrialization of the region. The valley became an increasingly attractive location for manufacturing due to the valley's proximity to Lake Michigan, other local river systems, and railways. Therefore, the population of European colonizers settling in the valley grew rapidly in the 1800s, and in order to accommodate their growing settlements and future development, they filled the marshy valley with soil, gravel, and municipal and industrial wastes. They also straightened the Menomonee River and cut a network of canals to facilitate shipping and travel by water. These alterations to the natural landscape are indicative of not only technological advances, but also social processes that contribute to environmental change. In Cronin's Kennecott Journey, he highlights the importance of trade on local landscapes as well as broader environments. Trade is the result of individuals drawing a boundary as to what constitutes a useful resource versus a useless one. Some resources may only be considered useful or valuable to local populations, but others may be of interest to those who reside where those provisions are not readily available. Milwaukee's budding industry of the late 18th century was founded on fur trading, and industrial development allowed goods to be transported from farther distances more efficiently and with greater ease. This increasingly complex trade network produced a variety of ecological changes in and around the Menomonee River Valley. As previously mentioned, the ecology of the valley and the river itself changed in order to accommodate the booming industrial complexes that sprung up around its banks. Wild rice was no longer able to grow in the marshy valley after it was filled with dry soil and other materials. The beaver population declined due to the importance of fur trading for the North American economy during this time period, and invasive species were introduced that threatened Milwaukee's native fish populations and its native prairie grasses. There have been efforts in more recent history to undo the negative ecological consequences that globalization and industrialization have had on the Menomonee River, but I will cover that in more detail later. Another important concept that Cronin detailed in his discussion of environmental history is the social geography that arises from people's interactions with their environments. Complex boundaries of socioeconomic status, gender, race, and ethnicity arise as people construct their own social environments from their natural landscapes. Since the 1960s, the Menomonee River Valley has often been known as the Milwaukee-Mason-Dixon line because it separates the predominantly white south side from the predominantly black north side. This stark segregation is in part the product of African Americans migrating from the South during the Great Migration that occurred from 1910 to 1970. Typically, migrants tend to settle with members of their own racial/ethnic group, but this so-called self-segregation is not to blame for Milwaukee being the most highly segregated state in the U.S. There are a myriad of government and industry policies and social attitudes that have contributed to the racial divide that is still present in Milwaukee today. Areas with large populations of racial and ethnic minorities were classified as red zones by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the late 1930s, which you can see here in this picture. These areas were classified as hazardous, meaning that people who live within these zones are considered too risky to loan to. This bars these individuals from becoming homeowners and prevents them from achieving economic success that would allow them to move to wider, wealthier areas of the city. Additionally, white flight, gentrification, and the decline of manufacturing have also contributed to the aforementioned policies and attitudes that reinforce racial segregation. The influence of racial, ethnic, gendered, and class categorizations in how people are organized and/or organize themselves is an important aspect of environmental history that, as Cronin points out, tends to be overlooked and understudied. However, these categories have large implications in terms of the social importance and reputation of Milwaukee's Menomonee River. Now to revisit the cleanup efforts that I briefly mentioned earlier. According to Ostrom, anyone who arranges for the provision of a common pool resource earns the title of a provider. In the late 90s, a variety of institutions became providers by preparing a land use plan for the Menomonee River Valley. The City of Milwaukee, the Menomonee Valley Business Association, and the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District have all been working to correct the environmental damage done to the Menomonee River Valley that was the result of over 100 years of unchecked industrial development. In 1869, the City of Milwaukee began working on a sewage system, but these efforts did little more than direct the raw sewage to the rivers. This same year marked the opening of multiple tanneries and stockyards in the river valley, which processed thousands of animals on a daily basis. The industrial runoff, which included blood, organs, and manure, turned the river into a revolting sludge. Almost a decade later, an 1878 Health Commission report found that 100 tons of excrement was washed into the river every day. In addition to the human and animal waste that served as contaminants, the tanneries used the river to rinse off the tanned hides, which washed a significant amount of hair and flesh into the bloody, waste-filled water. The river also served as a dumping ground for the leftover chemical cocktail used in the tanning process. There were some rudimentary efforts to decontaminate the water, like treating it with antiseptic bark juice or pumping fresh water in from Lake Michigan to flush the waste out, but this did very little in terms of remedying the problem. In fact, the flushing led to waste traveling into Lake Michigan and contaminating the city's drinking water. The first steps taken by the state to start combating water pollution in earnest were in 1909, and these efforts intensified throughout the 20th century as legislation like the Clean Water Act came into effect, limiting the amount of pollutants and contaminants that companies were allowed to emit without facing fines. The water quality of the Menomonee River has made large improvements as a result of these more recent provision efforts, which have included not only limiting the amount of pollutants entering into the river, but also monitoring the condition of the water, treating it when need be, restoring stream beds to allow for fish passage, among other projects to ensure that the river remains clean and healthy. And just a little explanation of my pictures. This top one shows a Wisconsin DNR worker running tests on polluted river water in 1978. And this bottom picture here is one that I took during one of my observation days, and it's a Milwaukee Sewerage District boat, which I assume was doing testing or treatment or something like that. Moving on to O'Neill, Holland, and Light's environmental values. The Menomonee River embodies all three of the values listed in the introduction of the text. From values refer to humanity's need to sustain themselves from crops, use natural materials in order to construct habitation, and just generally complete the tasks that required the direct use of natural resources. This was a more prevalent value when Native Americans were the primary and/or only inhabitants of the river valley. Their main source of food was the wild rice that was abundant in the river valley, among other native crops and animals. As the region became more industrialized, society has moved towards secondary and tertiary jobs, as opposed to the majority of the population engaging in primary jobs. Therefore, the economy has become more reliant on manufacturing and service jobs as opposed to jobs that center around obtaining raw material from the earth, meaning that Milwaukeeans utilize the Menomonee River's from values much less than they have in the past. However, the river's in and with value has increased as its from value has diminished over time. In value refers to the fact that environments matter to us for social, aesthetic, and cultural reasons. We can see this value exemplified in the various recreational opportunities that are available during the warmer months, like kayaking, canoeing, boating, and fishing. Marquette's rowing team even practices in the Menomonee River. There are also a few establishments located along the river, namely the restaurant The Twisted Fisherman, City Lights Brewing Company, and Marquette's Valley Fields, that provide an opportunity for simultaneous appreciation of the aesthetic value of the river while allowing for social interaction. Finally, the Hank Aaron Trail, depicted in this bottom image here, runs for 12 miles along the Menomonee and is a perfect demonstration of the river's width value. This project has helped to restore the wetlands around the river and help diminish erosion and filter out potential contaminants from runoff. These restoration efforts, as well as the efforts to decontaminate the polluted water that I previously mentioned, are indicative of the river's intrinsic value to the city of Milwaukee. The tree-lined walking paths of the Hank Aaron Trail are available for Milwaukeeans to stroll along the river and appreciate its beauty and its importance to the city. And up here I've just included a picture of the valley from 2002, and you can see that there are no obvious signs of pollution or damage, as opposed to the picture from the 70s that I showed you earlier. The Menomonee River and its adjoining valley have played a unique and invaluable role in the history of Milwaukee. Its historical, economic, and social importance have been fundamental in producing the Milwaukee that we know and love today. Although the river is no longer the manufacturing powerhouse that it once was, it has become a site of recreation for Milwaukeeans and a way to encounter a bit of nature in its overwhelmingly urban backdrop. Thank you.